So let's look at some artists from this time period. Uh, those of you who didn't know this, whenever you signed up for AP European History, you were also signing up to take an art class. Okay, so let's look at Michelangelo Buonarroti. Okay, uh, bet you didn't know that he had a last name. Most people just think of him as Michelangelo, but Buonarroti is his last name. He's famous for sculpture, for architecture, and for painting. Okay, so sculpture, really one of the most famous sculptures in the world is David. I actually got to see, well, they don't put the normal David out for everyone to see, so they did recreation of it, but it's identical. And so I got to go to Florence to go see that. They have it actually locked up in a museum, but if you've seen one 10-foot naked statue of David, you've seen all the naked statues of David. Okay? He also did Pieta. He also painted the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling of that. And if you've ever gotten a chance to go into that and just the enormity of that and just how amazing it is, the massive mural on the ceiling. And he also does the Last Judgment, which is on another wall in the Sistine Chapel. And the first time he did it, he didn't negotiate well, and he was forced to pay for his own paint. And the paint was very expensive, so he didn't make much money off of doing the Sistine Chapel, even though the majority of the time he was, you know, looking straight up and painting, putting a horrible crick in his neck. Okay, so whenever he does the Last Judgment, he draws animals and he puts on some of the guys that were upset about the amount they had to pay him to do the Last Judgment. St. Peter's Basilica Dome is fantastic. You can see it on the right hand side. That was a design that he came up with himself. Really, there weren't a lot of domes for a long time because the while the Romans had mastered the building of domes, you know, there's it's a very specialized skill to make one. Okay, the Laurentian Library also was something that he designed architecturally. Anyway, truly one of the masters and very skilled. By the way, back to the Sistine Chapel, this image right here of God and David. If this were today, they'd have to have on gloves and masks. So, it's a much different world than it was 500 years ago. Anyway, uh, Filippo Brunelleschi. Okay, uh, he uh, he cast bronze statues and he painted. He also created one of the largest domes in the world, the Il Duomo, or Il Domo. That is, by the way, it's breathtaking, it's gorgeous, and it's massive. And for the times that they had, and some of the sculptures that they did, uh, I don't know, it's fantastic. He also designed the Church of San Lorenzo, uh, and he had these large columns and large arches. Okay, you can see that picture over on the right hand side, all the large arches with the pillars. Okay, but again, we're building bigger and I guess better. So I don't know. Part of the Renaissance is I guess Americanizing just how big you build everything. But you look at the beauty of that, and unlike most things that are built in the United States where it's just utilitarian, these are really creations of beauty, and it takes a lot of time to build these things. Now, Leonardo da Vinci. Okay, so Leonardo da Vinci, he was also someone who could do anything. Okay. Most importantly, with his paintings, his three most famous paintings, you have the Mona Lisa, who some believe was a self-portrait of Da Vinci. You see the Last Supper, where 13 men get together and eat, and take up all the table space there by eating just on the one side of the table. Okay, we'll have a table for 26. But there's only 13 of you. Well, we're all going to sit on the same side. Wow. Anyway, moving on, Madonna of the Rocks. Again, just another magnificent work of art. Uh, he designed weapons. He designed uh, anatomical structures you can see over here in the bottom right hand space. His the way he captured muscle. It was things that people had not done at that time and didn't really have concepts on where to get started. To hide his ideas, he wrote backwards a lot. Uh, he worked in science, engineering, every field he could get his hands on, he would, and he was magnificent in everything he did. Truly a master. He designed some of the first flying equipment also. Raphael. He worked in Rome, so most of these other guys that we've talked about so far were all based out of Florence. And if you've ever been to Florence, it is gorgeous, and you can understand how it would inspire people to do great things. Okay, uh, he mimicked a lot of the Greek works. Uh, he paints several portraits of Madonna, the mother of Jesus. Uh, but again, his style was a little bit different, but it was still fresh for the time that they lived in. Okay. So you have on the one hand uh, the Florentine artist of Da Vinci and Michelangelo, and then you have from the Roman side you have Raphael. You have Christine de Pizan. She was a French woman who she defends women's intellectual capabilities. This is still a time period, and by the way, this lasts much longer than this. There's a long time period where it's believed that you can't teach women much because since they have smaller heads and smaller brains, that they could have strokes or their bodies would just shut down from having to learn the things that men had to learn. And she actually made a living from her writing, which was really unique for a woman of the late 1300s, early 1400s. Isabella d'Este. She starts a school for girls, and she wrote really important letters that people actually took and studied. Again, very uncommon for this time for anything that a woman wrote to be recognized as important. Lara Serreta, she was widowed early, so she had money from her marriage, and she wrote for equality and wanted all women to have equality with men. Again, these are some cases of some women that were able to do things that normally women couldn't do. Not that they weren't capable of it, but society prevented them from doing it in many cases. You might even be declared a witch if you were doing this. So, centralization of the 14th and 15th centuries. Okay, so at the very top you have taxation. This is done by nobility, and they didn't have to have legislative approval. So they would just tax the people. Okay, so the taming of the aristocracy, they formed alliances with the middle class called the nobles of the robe, and this was an early attempt to create checks and balances. You have the codification of laws and creating courts, where monarchs and kings, monarchs of kings and queens, they created royal courts to make more uniform laws, to allow them to govern the country without having to do all the dirty work. Okay, so they're not doing this to be noble. They're not doing this to spread equality. They're doing this to take things off their plate. Uh, Controlling warfare. You no longer had private armies by lords and earls and dukes. The king now had control over everything, and so these were now all the armies of the kings. So there were no private armies held by people in the countries. Early bureaucracy and officials, committees, councils, and representative bodies. All of this was created to help the king, or in some cases, the queen, uh, control the people. Okay, and you also have religious control. You have authority over clergy and functions of the church. So the government was setting itself up in a position to be able to control what the church was doing, or even control appointments to the church. Okay, so Europe of the 15th century. Okay, uh, France, Spain, and England were building modern states. Okay, uh, and they were able to help control the direction of the church, the nobles. They were also starting to collect taxes at this time. Okay, and you're slowly starting to see the creation of modern nations of Europe. And by the way, later on we'll get to the Teutonic Order up here, uh, and Teutonic theory. This is something that Hitler will really jump on, and basically this Teutonic theory, or this belief by Germans that uh, Germans were famous for being great fighters. Okay, at one point they will topple the Roman Empire. At another point, they will stop Genghis Khan from invading Europe, and so there's this almost sense of invincibility. And basically, they believe being that they were looked upon fondly by the angels, and so angels came down from heaven to have sex with these German people and create children. And this is called the Teutonic theory, and this is the idea of why the Germans were blonde-haired, blue eyes. And whenever the church would try and incorporate the German people into the Christian faith, they would use these murals, or not murals, but stained glass windows in churches and murals in churches to kind of show that angels are blonde haired and blue eyed, and that's what you look like, so you're obviously descended from angels. So the church will actually help perpetuate this whole thought that that the Germans were descended from angels. So when Hitler uses this later on to frame what a what an Aryan looks like, this all comes from this time. So sorry, I took one word of Teutonic right here and gave an explanation, but we'll get back to this probably sometime around spring break and talk more about the Teutonic theory. But it's not something that Hitler made up. It'd been around and he just jumped on it. And, anytime you have a group where you're explaining how they're the master race and you're not part of it, people are more willing to listen. I'm not telling anyone to go and Hitler something. I'm just saying that's why it was more accepted. In fact, if I catch anyone doing a Hitler thing like that, I'm going to write you up. Okay, so the Papal States. Okay, Alexander the Sixth. He ruled for a little bit over 9 years, and he had children. So not the popiest of popes. Okay, uh, he had his children get into marriages where he created alliances. So Julius II, he's known as the warrior pope, and he actually physically led armies into war and you know killed people. You know, again, not a very popey thing to do. Uh, he also was responsible for projects like the Sistine Chapel and taking advantage of Michelangelo and making him buy his own paint. That's why you always have to be careful with contracts you sign. You know, you never know when you're going to have to buy your own paint. Okay, so France at this time was in recovery after the Hundred Years' War that was fought in France. As a result of the war, they will extend its territory. They had Europe's largest army. They actually had almost the largest population base as well. And they also created a tax system. Now, that tax system was created under Charles VI. Okay, he worked with the Estates General and he created a tax called the tile. Okay, the tile was a direct tax, and you know people underneath him collected it. He also created an army with archers and a cavalry. These are things that they learned from the Hundred Years' War. Uh, Also, one of the most valuable things at the time was salt for its ability to preserve food, and France created a salt monopoly called the Gabelle. Now let's get to one of the uglier people we're going to talk about, and that's Louis the XI. He was called the Spider, probably because his mom was bit by a bunch of spiders while she was pregnant, making him an ugly creature like you see there to the left. That's not, hopefully, that's not what his nose really looked like. He was in charge for a total of 22 years, and he was able to add territory through marriage, and he conquered part of Burgundy. So it helps create this new shape of Europe, particularly for France. England, okay, they established. I don't. That's not really a word. They established England. My God, I can't speak anymore. Here, just a minute. Okay, England established English political and commercial power. So they were great at doing business. They had their government structure together, and a lot of this happened as a result of the War of the Roses. So for about 30 years, there's a war between two major houses. Okay, one is the House of Lancaster, which the symbol for their house was the red rose. Okay, and the House of York, whose symbol was the white rose. Okay, now the house that was in power before was under Richard III. Okay, this is a dynasty that had lasted for hundreds of years. So Henry VI won the war, and he took over, and his family would rule for a total of uh, well, a little bit over 120 years. Okay, uh, so Henry VI was part of the Tudor family and the Tudor dynasty. Tudor with a D, not with a T, so it has nothing to do with farting, although Henry VIII was famous for his flatulence among divorcing and murdering his wives. Henry VII, okay, this would be the son of Henry VI. I don't know if you sense a theme here, but not a lot of efforts put into naming people. Okay, so he cuts down the number of dukes from 9 to 2. He takes away the private armies of his noblemen because at that point, if you were a noble, you could take advantage of the king and force them to do what you wanted by withholding your troops, particularly if you had a good or large army. Henry VII also created the first national navy. Again, before this, it was all done by private navies of different dukes and lords. Okay, uh, he was a pretty good diplomat. He managed to avoid any major wars in his time period, and so he was really wealthy, and England was really wealthy during this time. They also created the Star Chamber, and this was a system of royal courts that was not controlled by Parliament. They were supposed to answer to the king, but over time they would also split off from that and kind of create a separation of powers, kind of like the United States has. Not fully, but kind of the start of that. Well, we've ended the end of class today. And now the time has come. It's time to face the final. Uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. Everyone have a great day and a great night. Be safe and say no to drugs and diseases and murder. Stuck Dylan.